Well, there's been a change, as you may have noticed in the last 6 months. The international order, which in many ways stemmed from the collaboration between the United States and Britain and later with others during World War II and helped create the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, ultimately with the inability to have the United Nations be the primary guarantor of collective security, the creation of security alliances, including, importantly, that of NATO at the not only the past, but the pressure led by Britain at the time in the late 1940s. That system has worked extraordinarily well over the past 80 years to ensure through a management that the United States led, but many others contributed, including Great Britain, to a great extent, to an unprecedented era of security, of peace, of freedom, and of prosperity. It's been an extraordinary era in which the United States and the UK, among others, collaborated to maintain that order, to strengthen it, to adapt it to new circumstances. That order may remain, but the United States is no longer the guarantor of that order. It is now being led by a president and an administration that believe, in the words of its Secretary of State in his hearing before the US Senate, that the post-war era was weaponized against the United States. And that is a quote. And Secretary Rubio and others strongly believe these days that the order that the United States helped create and maintain, that has guided American and indeed Western policy for over 80 years, is an order that needs to disappear. That the United States needs to take primary responsibility for only its own interests. That the best way to advance American interests is not to uphold an order that has been extraordinarily good for America, but actually to overturn it. And we have seen that in its approach to security and alliances. We are seeing it in its approach to the international global economy. And I think most destructively, we have seen it in its decision to abandon long-held American and indeed international views about multilateral institutions and the importance of soft power. So I think the challenge for the UK, which I still believe is fully on board to support this international order, is to find new partners to do so. It is one of the reasons I believe that the UK is looking once again towards Europe, but also towards friends and allies in North America, primarily Canada, of course, and increasingly in Asia. Countries like Japan and Australia, countries within the European Union and Canada, are countries that still uphold this order, believe in it, believe that their security, their prosperity, and their freedom is advanced by it. And if the United States doesn't want to play a part of it, that is for the United States to decide, but it doesn't mean that the UK and others should move in a different direction. So I think the partnership that was created back in World War II is in a very precarious state, mainly because of the decisions made by this president and this administration in the last 6 months.
Thank you. And Mr. Dworkin.
Yes, well, I'd very much echo what Ambassador Daalder said. I think, in the UK, I think there is a strong sense of this shared history. There's a strong sense of the importance for the United Kingdom of preserving as far as possible a rules-based international system. We've seen, I think, some variations in how the approach to international order, to the rules-based system is interpreted, how much it's still in the UK's interest to work primarily through the kind of collective UN-based institutions, how much to work more through, in an era of increasing global competition, through like-minded bodies like the G7 and others. Perhaps we can talk more about the balancing act between those two. I think it's worth acknowledging that probably there's a recognition in, among many policymakers here in the UK that, that some changes in the order probably are inevitable. We've seen a lot of changes in international power and the balance of power and the kind of power dynamics in the international system. But I think what they would really, what this country and its officials would like to see would be to work, with the United States and with other like-minded partners to try and preserve and at the same time reform the system of global governance to make it effective and responsive to current challenges. But as Ambassador Daalder said, I think when you look across the Atlantic now, you see a former partner that really is no longer interested in being a co-steward. I think it's clearly a matter of reality that the United Kingdom needs to work with others. We don't here have the power and global influence to act alone. It's not even clear that the United States would have that now. And so I think that there is very much this question of who are going to be our partners now. And I think perhaps it's worth highlighting, the kind of anomaly of the current situation is not only is the United States not presenting itself as a partner to the UK in working to preserve and reform the system of global governance, but in some ways I think our commitment here to a rules-based order and our relationship with the United States are even in tension. And if you look at, for instance, the trade deal that the UK recently agreed with President Trump, you can clearly see some tensions between the terms of that deal and the principles underlying the rules-based trading system. So I think the UK is in that sense quite a difficult position. One other point, along the same lines, we have Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a British national, is currently under sanction from the United States for actions taken in pursuance of his mandate as a prosecutor. So again, that's another point of tension.
Thank you. Lord Groker, did you have a supplementary?
Yes, from time to time it can be a bit nebulous what's meant by the international order. I think we can all agree on that. It's not subject to precise definition, I don't think. And what I'd like to understand from the Americans' point of view, are they saying that there is an international order, but we're not going to play any part in it, we don't agree with it, it's wrong? Are they saying there's no such thing as an international order, or are they saying that we might be able to support an international order if such a thing existed, if it was differently defined? I mean, have they just given up on the whole thing, or is it capable of resuscitation?
Who would you like to ask that question to?
I think the ambassador, please, first.
Well, thank you, Lord Griffith, for that question. So there is always an international order, and I do believe that the current administration sees an international order. What is different is that for 80 years we've had a rules-based international order, an international order that recognized certain institutions and rules beyond the nation state as affecting and guiding and shaping international behavior of states. Rules that are reflected in the Charter of the United Nations, rules that are reflected in the organization of the Bretton Woods financial and the WTO's trading system, rules that led to security alliances along the lines of NATO. What this administration is against is not international order per se, it's against rules that constrain America in its behavior. And what it seeks is to be an America unbound by the rules of the system and indeed willing to and able to change them at a whim. The order it seeks in some ways, and it's hard to pin it down because this is a very different kind of American administration than we've had in the past. It has a sole decision maker who at times within a paragraph can change his mind or have different perspectives. So it's hard to know exactly what he wants. But one gathers from the way he has governed that he is interested in sort of two sets of ways in which the international order is evolving. One is an order based on power. And those that have the most power should get the most say. It is a order that the great general and historian Thucydides described about the Peloponnesian War, and particularly in his description of the Melian dialogue between where the Athenians told the Melians that who were weaker at the time that they shall do as they must, and the strong will do as they will. That's the world he wants to live in. In fact, that's the world that Donald Trump thinks he's living in. It's why he's able, he thinks, to dictate trading terms and other terms, dictate how much other countries spend or do not spend on defense, because the United States has that power. That's one aspect of his worldview that translates in the way that the order evolves. The other is that he tends to look at other strong, big countries, primarily Russia and at least Russia until recently, and China, as similarly inclined to pursue their own interests on the basis of power. And to recognize that and to think that the world may be better off if it was divided into spheres of influence, much like we have seen in the 19th century, between competing powers, in which the competing powers recognize those spheres of influence, China in Asia, Russia to some extent in Europe, and of course the United States in the Western Hemisphere. You may recall that at the outset of the administration, there was a lot of talk by the president about making Greenland part of the United States, making Canada the 51st state, taking over the Panama Canal, all critical parts of the Western Hemisphere and control of the Western Hemisphere. And so the international order that the Trump administration is talking about, in some ways, by the way, not that different from the international order that both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are talking about, is an order based on power rather than rules. That is the fundamental difference. And the problem for countries like the UK is that because they don't single-handedly have the power to affect the behavior of the stronger nations, it needs to find other friends. It needs to find other allies in order to both counter those who are using power to enforce the will, and to maintain whatever rules-based order might exist within the relations among those countries. And I think that is exactly what the UK has been trying to do in the last 6+ months, as indeed has Canada, the European Union, to some extent, Japan. There are issues there, Australia and others. And I would think that part of the future of the US-UK relationship is that the UK is increasingly going to align, and will have to align, with other countries in order to counter America's whims and power. Thank you.
Anything to add at all?
No, I mean, I think, maybe I just kind of pick up one point, which I think is crucial, that, clearly the conception of the national interest, which we see being pursued by this administration, is one where the kinds of predictability and stability of international rules and institutions are not seen as something that contributes to all countries in the world being able to achieve, greater collective goods, but rather, as Ambassador Daalder says, as something which prevents and constrains the United States from achieving what it could achieve through a more direct and transactional use of its own power. And that is a real dilemma for the UK in looking for a potential partnership with the US.
Lord Horton.
Well, thank you. Those two opening comments from you both have rather sort of shocked me. I think we're making dynamic adjustments to our questions in the light of what's been said, such is the powerful nature of those remarks, because it appears to, as it were, completely abandon any sort of sense of the teleological certainty of human harmony evolving over time, so long as we can all roughly stay on the same track. And I wonder, therefore, whether or not you can offer any hope in the context to which what we're experiencing at the moment is maybe just a hiccup in time, because in many respects, what the aim of the committee's study in many respects is not just to make a judgment of the moment, but to know whether or not we might, at the end of this Trump administration, and who knows that the sort of the 2-year point, his ability to do what he's doing now might in some ways be constrained, whether or not it is an expression of the will of the American people to be, as appears to be the case, or whether or not there may be a similarly bold correction back to a more enlightened approach to multilateralism, and in that context, where are the things that you sense a future administration might converge with the United Kingdom and the rest of the world and Russia and China and all that and get on a bit to resolve some of the world's great challenges, or when and where will those remaining divisions of, dare I say, policy of sort of power and selfishness remain? And perhaps, Ambassador, if you can kick off again, because it's great to hear what you're saying, even though it's somewhat sobering and spoiling my afternoon. Thank you.
It's one of the reasons my liver is not doing as well in the last 6 months as it did before, but that's it's still early for drinking. I'm afraid. I don't want to give all hope, but I do think that whatever happens afterwards is not going to be the same as what came before. And the fundamental reason is that the United States, really from December 7, 1941, until quite recently, earned an incredible degree of international trust in its judgments, in its behavior, in its willingness to uphold an international order, to provide public goods by supporting institutions that not only benefited the United States, which by definition they did, but also others. And that in the past 6 months, that trust is gone. It has disappeared. And in every relationship in which that is at its core based on trust, and by the way, in my own background, alliances are at their core based on the trust that your allies will come to your defense, because that's all it is. It's trust. It's not a legal thing that you can write down in a treaty. It is the belief that it will in fact happen. And that will deter your enemies and ultimately defeat them if they are not deterred. That trust is gone. I'm not. I don't have to speak for you here in the House of Lords, but in every conversation I have with every allied country and official, the last 6 months has destroyed that trust. And so the United States may well come back and realize that after what I am calling the Great Suicide, the United States, in my view, is committing suicide as a great power, undermining its own power, not understanding its own interests, not getting that working together with its like-minded friends and partners around the world is fundamental to achieving its goals, but believing wrongly that it can use power in a way that that will get its short-term gain. It may, but in the long term, it will not. In the long term, it will hurt the United States greatly. That country may decide that, in fact, this experiment they've had with Donald Trump's policies needs to be reversed. But if and when that happens, it will be a weaker United States that comes back to the global scene. And it will be a United States less trusted. And in some ways, the relationship I think the United States will have with other countries, like-minded countries, which I hope we would want to continue to work with, will be far more one of equals, rather than it has been in the past 80 years, one of unequals, one of the United States not only being just first among equal, but unquestionably first among equal. And that the kind of leadership that the United States has demonstrated over the last 80 years would be impossible to execute. It would have to be shared with the UK, share it with friends in Europe, share it with friends in Asia. Now, that creates extraordinary obligations on what used to be our allies, on the UK and others, to actually lead in ways that hasn't been the case for a very long time, because there's been a deference to the United States, a belief that the U.S. that we, the U.K., could help the U.S. as it pursued its leadership. But now there won't be the same deference. And so the nature of the international effort, particularly if you still confront a very strong, which I believe we will, and adversarial China, and a very militarized Russia, the nature of working together will be very different. Now, my optimism relies on this. We have seen in the last 6 months a number of countries and a number of leaders, and I would put the UK squarely in the middle of that, of taking up that challenge, as we have seen just with regard to Ukraine, an effort by the Prime Minister, by the Chancellor Merz, by NATO Secretary Rutte, to some extent Emmanuel Macron, has turned Trump around on the issue of Ukraine and Russia, and perhaps 70% rather than 100%, or 50% rather than 100%, but it's better than where we were. A willingness to sell weapons, a willingness to consider possibility of sanctions on Russia. And that was extraordinary diplomacy and leadership on the part of those countries and leaders. And I think that is the future. A future of more equal power. It's not a bad future for the UK. It's just a terrible future for the United States.
Mr. Dworkin, do you like to comment as well?
Yes, I mean, I agree very much. I suppose what I would highlight is that I think, although what the current president has done is a radical departure, it's not doesn't come out of nowhere. And I think that we can identify, looking at the United States from the UK, we can identify there is a strain in the US, in American political culture, which is not, which is to some degree skeptical of some forms of international organization and international law, particularly those that would constrain the sort of democratic sovereignty of the United States. And I think, this strain has been there. We see it in, for instance, the U.S. decision not to join the International Criminal Court. We see it in moves against the United Nations undertaken by previous administrations of one sort or another. So I think there's some suspicion. And the other thing which I think is worth bearing in mind, as I mentioned before, I think already the global balance of power was changing. I think President Trump is not the first American president to think that this kind of leadership role that the United States was playing was one that's no longer really could be continued in the same way as before, partly because of shifts in the global balance of power, the rise of China, as Ambassador Daalder mentioned, as a really serious competitor, I think is forcing a sense not only among Trump and his circle, but more widely, that the U.S. needs to reassess its priorities, needs to reassess, as I mentioned, the degree to which it thinks that it can work through collective global organizations which do involve some sort of cooperation with China, the UN and World Health Organization and others, and how much it makes more sense to work among like-minded groups, like the kinds of security alliances, NATO, G7, and a variety of other kinds of processes, which perhaps we'll discuss a bit more as we go along. So I think there are kind of some pre-existing issues and strains and trends which inevitably I think will be there after President Trump leaves. But that does take me to very much the same place, that I think a return to the old vision of the U.S. as the leader of the free world is not would not be on the cards in any case. And I think we do need to look for new forms of international governance that are more reflective of the world we're in. But I think we're in a position now where that effort has to go forward essentially without the United States, because it's really opted out of the business of trying to find stable rules-based governance at all.
Thank you. Following on from your last two answers, President Trump his scepticism towards some multilateral organisations has been quite specific in some cases. His stated intention to disengage from the WHO and Gavi, for example. But is this really just down to Trump, or is this a reflection of a shift over the last couple of decades within the US? And could you say, as you answer that question, whether there's any distinction between the US administration's attitude towards multilateral institutions and the US population's attitude? I mean, you just, Mr. Dworkin, you mentioned US culture just now, and I wonder if you could expand on that in relation to that. Do people in the US have the same kind of cynicism towards multilateral institutions as the administration appears currently to have? Perhaps Ambassador Daalder, you could begin.
Yeah, I'm glad to. I think it's important to distinguish between, as you rightly do in your question, between policy as executed by a variety of administrations and the public. And let me start with the first. You are absolutely right that there has been, and Mr. Dworkin said so rightly, a growing degree of skepticism on the part of American policymakers to be bound by international rules and international institutions. This is not new. In 20 some years ago, I wrote a book with Jim Lindsay called America Unbound, the Bush Revolution in Foreign Policy, in which our primary argument was that George W. Bush wanted to be unconstrained from rules and institutions that it saw as, in some ways, tying America down. And you may recall that after 9/11, even though NATO invoked for the first and only time Article 5, the United States decided that it would go after, invade and bomb Afghanistan as part of a coalition of the willing, with the UK as part of that. But not as part of a NATO operation, which came much later as a peacekeeping operation. That the decision on Iraq was not fully consistent with the international rules and the international norms, something I know that this body and others have been debating for a very long time. So in that sense, it's nothing new. Ronald Reagan withdrew from UNESCO just to go back into history, a decision, by the way, now repeated, I guess, for the fourth time on the part of the United States just the other day. So in that sense, there is when you are the most powerful country in the world, rules that apply equally to the most powerful and the weaker ones are rules that you are sometimes don't like, and you don't feel that you want to be constrained by it. Again, as Mr. Dworkin rightly said, there is a reason why the U.S. military opposed the U.S. joining the International Criminal Court, because they believed that would affect American soldiers perhaps more than others, because they are more engaged in international conflict. So there is a long-standing American belief that the rules are great for others, but not necessarily for the United States. That's true for all great powers, even those great powers that in the end believe in a rules-based international order, as I think the United States did for most of its post-war history until very recently. When it comes to the question of public opinion, what's actually interesting here, and as I mentioned, until recently, I was the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the council for the last 50 years has been doing in-depth polling on American attitudes and foreign policy, probably the longest standing longitudinal studies on American foreign policy. And even today, support for this idea that you should be restrained, America can be constrained by international rule and international institutions because ultimately it serves America better, enjoys widespread support among Americans by 3-1, 4-1 margins. And even among Democrats and Republicans, The difference is not as stark as one might have thought on the question of should the United States exercise unilateral leadership or shared leadership? Shared leadership wins 60-40, 65-35. Should the United States be willing to work with others, even if that means that sometimes its own view will not win in the argument? Or should it just ignore others and do whatever it wants? Again, those results will have the first answer be supported by 2/3 of the American people. Questions of NATO and alliances. Alliances are seen as extraordinarily important to American leadership, to Americans' global engagement, and the willingness to cooperate with others are seen as supportive. The problem is that foreign policy for the average American, as I would argue probably for the average Briton itself, is not high on the list when it comes to voting. It's not a determinative factor. And so unless something goes terribly wrong, Vietnam, Iraq, to name two American mistakes of highly strategic importance, people vote on pocketbook issues, on other issues. And so that there is a disconnect between what administrations tend to do when it comes to foreign policy and what the American public in general will support. What that means, going back to the previous question, is there's plenty of a basis for a return to a more multilateral, a more rules-based, a more cooperative form of international engagement within the American body politic, if and when the leaders that are committed to that were to return to power.
Thank you. Mr. Dworkin.
Perhaps it's just worth adding as a footnote, although we've, I think, accurately been describing this administration's broad hostility towards multilateralism and towards international organization, there are a few respects. I think that's very true, in particularly in relation to the sort of global public goods agenda, which has been a dominant form of multilateralism in recent years: health, climate, development. We saw the administration rejecting the Sustainable Development Goals. I think all of that is true, but there are a number of respects still in which the administration is committed to working within some international organizations. And these are particularly organizations that are seen as really contributing directly to U.S. interests. Obviously, the UN, there's going to be, I think, a significant reduction in funding. We already see that coming through. But there is a new ambassador to the UN who's going through the process of confirmation, and we're getting a sort of, some sense of what the US vision for the United Nations is going to be. It's more narrowly focused. The sort of back to basics agenda, I think, is really defining the sort of remaining commitment of this administration. But there will be some interest in peace and security. I think there will be some interest, and again, perhaps we could discuss this more in terms of reforming, streamlining, making the UN more efficient. Goals which are, perhaps, could be more widely shared and are not unreasonable, even if they're perhaps being addressed in an extreme way. And then to the relief, I think, of many abroad, the US has recommitted to its participation in the IMF and the World Bank. Although, again, we have this sort of back to basics idea guiding US participation, that these are supposed to concentrate more narrowly on their core mandate, which I think in the views of the Trump administration would mean not doing anything on climate and not doing that much on the Sustainable Development Goals, but concentrating really on the stability of the financial system. But I think although the World Bank is led by a rather skillful leader now, who I think will accentuate those parts of the program that are perhaps most appealing to the Trump administration. The World Bank is not going to get out of the business of working on climate and working on development, because these are integral to the organization's mission. And so And we've seen the United States in its budget. I mean, there is still, a significant amount of money. They've reduced it a little bit, but a significant amount of money for IDA, the World Bank's, kind of fund for the less, the least developed countries. So, I think there will still be some residual element, but with a kind of strong orientation in the direction I mentioned.
Lord Alderdice.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I'd like to probe just a little bit more this question of public opinion in terms of foreign policy, because to date, much of what we've been thinking about, speaking about, has been kind of pro-Trump and anti-Trump. But it seems to me that within the body of public opinion that supports President Trump, broadly speaking, there has been over the last month or two a divergence making its appearance. Tucker Carlson did a couple of interviews last month, one with Ted Cruz and one with Steve Bannon. And it was clear that on one side it was pro-isolation and the other was pro-intervention. And these are not just important differences within the United States. The impact of them on the rest of the world is quite profound. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more, because you've obviously, Ambassador, focused a lot on assessing and monitoring public opinion, whether you think there is indeed this divergence opening up and what impact it might have or not have on the presidency.
So about a third of American public opinion for 80 years has been isolationist. And that's been unchanging. There's about 1 in 3 Americans just believes that we are better off if we are not engaged in the world, and that is unchanging. What has sort of happened because of the Trump phenomenon in the last 10 years is that 1/3 has probably expanded to about 40%, particularly large in the Republican Party, and then rightly, as I think you mentioned, a split within them and between them. Between those who are true isolationists, who really do believe fundamentally that the United States is better off if it is more autarkic economically and in security terms than anything else, perhaps focused on the Western Hemisphere at most. And I think you saw in Tucker Carlson and in Steve Bannon and in part of the MAGA base that isolationist, true isolationist perspective. But that isolationist perspective, and in some ways J.D. Vance being part of that, although Vance has gone all over the place, as have so many of these guys. A second piece, which I think is where Donald Trump has always been, is America First. And while America First in the late 1930s was deeply isolationist, because the issue was, do you or do you not get involved in a war in Europe? And therefore, the America First argument was not doing so serves American interests better than doing so. So America First and isolation were one and the same thing. That's no longer the case. And in fact, it may never have been the case. And so the idea that you are promoting America's interests, including through the possibility of foreign intervention, as we saw, for example, with regard to the strikes against Iran, in the belief that America's interests fundamentally require that Iran does not get nuclear weapons. That's not inconsistent with a view that you don't work within alliances. So although both or within a rules-based system, so both strains within the MAGA movement, if you want to call it that, are anti the international rules-based order because they are constraints on American power. But what they will actually do when it comes to policy is divergent, and the debate will likely hit most acutely on the issue of China, and we can go into that in greater detail. But there is one strand that believes decoupling from China is absolutely required. That tends to be the more isolationist strand, and another says no. America First requires us to make a deal. And a deal that may sacrifice Taiwan, a deal that may sacrifice our alliances in East Asia, but a deal with China, which is where I happen to believe the president is and will land. And that will have a huge impact on the Republican coalition in particular, because much of the Republican coalition, including his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, are China hawks. I don't believe the president is, and we'll see how that plays out. But that's part of where that debate is going to be.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Mr. Dworkin?
No, nothing to add.
Thank you, Lord Speaker.
Soames.
Thank you very much, Lord Chairman. Ambassador, it is entirely possible that this fox has already been shot. So, if you could, if you have partially answered this question, both of you. But given the background to what we've been talking about today, what do you actually consider are the most important and significant causes of friction between the United States and the multilateral organizations today?
I think the most important cause of friction, Lord Soames, is the unwillingness of the United States to play by the same rules as everyone else, because they believe that those rules constrain America in its ability to do what it wants and needs to do. And they believe, and I think this is critically important, and I think one of the distinctions between the U.S. and many others, that not abiding by the rules, by defying them, has no cost, and in fact a gain. And I happen to believe that that is fundamentally mistaken. I do believe that adhering to the trading system is good for the United States, but that's not the view of this administration. They will argue that the trade deals that they are negotiating are going to be good for the United States. I beg to differ, and we will see in history whether that's the case or not. I think a unilateral way of thinking about security is ultimately deleterious to American security and American interest. But that is the fundamental tension. The fundamental tension is that the United States believes that rules and norms and institutions are constraints on American behavior, and that we now have the power to do what we want. And while others may not, that's too bad for them. It's not. It's fine with us. That is the tension that exists. It's always existed. It's just exploded in a way that that few of us had thought was likely until about 10 years ago.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dworkin.
Just in one sentence, I'd echo that. I think what we see from the source of tension is the vision that we see coming from this president and to some extent his administration, which is an extraordinarily narrow vision of how American interests are best served. Clearly a real dichotomy between the sense of this is America's interests and that's the sort of global public goods agenda, which simply takes advantage of the United States rather than serving its interests. And to some extent added to that, and I think going along with it, is a sense that the sort of ideological debates and battles that the president is pursuing within the United States to some degree can be replicated on the international scene. And so I think he sees, when he looks at the United Nations and some international processes with their emphasis on greater inclusion, greater representation for the global South, a sort of echo of the war on woke and DEI and so on that he's conducting within the United States. So I think those two go together.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Ms. Fraser.
Thank you. As Lord Horton said, our aim in this inquiry is to try and look beyond the present day and to identify the trends of the future. So I want to turn to the future, and if we're looking at the future of multilateralism, what are the alternatives to institutions? Mr. Dworkin, you've talked about aiming for smaller groups of like-minded partners with shared principles. Are these any more palatable to the US, do you think? But actually, for the UK, what should be the guiding principles for us? If I could start with you, Mr. Dworkin.
Yes, I think it's been, even going back before this administration, it's been a notable picture of the international scene, I think, for a number of years, the growth of these kinds of alternative, whether you call them plurilateral or minilateral mechanisms. And I think that reflects really two things. One is, simply the difficulty of working through an international system that contains, kind of many more states now than when the sort of central institutions were initially set up. And not only that, but I think we see a greater divergence, a greater sense of geopolitical competition with China, with Russia, and with others with different views, which I think can make it difficult to reach agreement or even to sort of pursue the kinds of values-based solutions that we want through formal international institutions, particularly the collective ones associated with the UN. And so we've seen a number of these different groups growing up in many different areas, whether it's in climate, health, security, and so on, development. And clubs and task forces and coalitions and one sort or another have proliferated. And I think that, to my mind, is helpful. But in some of my own work, I've developed this idea of what I call the twin track strategy, which is how to combine our support for, if we still believe in the value of the collective institutions, but also the greater efficacy and the greater ability to sort of pursue our own distinctive vision through more like-minded groups. How can these two be combined? And so I think the principles that I set out really are, first of all, that the sort of smaller groups should be pursued in a way that's not undermining the greater collective bodies, but can sort of sit within them or alongside them and aligned with them. And secondly, that these smaller groups should be open on the basis of anyone who sort of subscribes to the fundamental guiding principles of these coalitions. And I think, this is an area where I think the UK, Europe, and other partners and the United States could work together. And in fact, I was quite struck that under the Biden administration, the national security strategy that they produced actually used the same phrase of a twin-track strategy to international cooperation. I think the scope for pursuing it now under this administration is more limited. There may be some areas where it's possible to find alignment. For instance, there is, I think, a remaining interest that we see coming through quite strongly, although it's quite hostile to a lot of forms of development. It's quite supportive to a sort of private sector-led vision of development. So one institution that's prospering in the US in the development field, as everything else is being decimated, is the DFC, Development Finance Corporation, which is being given a lot more money or a kind of different funding mechanism. And this is an area where, for instance, the UK has also been quite active through BII and others. So, there could be some scope there. Again, the G7 has been doing quite a lot in this field of infrastructure and so on in recent years. Whether, I think, I guess I'll end on this, whether the degree to which there is the potential to really work with the US on, in some of these smaller groups, I think depends, it faces the fact that, as Ambassador Daalder said, this administration seems really rather hostile to the notion of alliances, as well as the notion of broader international organizations. But I think a lot depends on where it lands on precisely the question that he raised at the end of his last answer about China. Because I think if the administration decides that the kind of guiding principle is going to be strategic competition with China, then I think working with like-minded groups does become perhaps more attractive. But if the vision is more transactional and we can do deals, including deals with China and so on, and that vision of the US interest prevails, then I think the scope is going to be a lot more limited.
Thank you. Ambassador Daalder, can you identify sort of alternatives or guiding principles, or, health is an interesting one with RFK Jr., for example, apparently stating a willingness to continue working on pandemic and global health security stuff. Do we have shared perceptions of threats? I mean, that might just dig into your comments on China is going to be the hill we all have to climb.
No, we don't have. I mean, and this is the interesting thing. We don't have shared perceptions of threats anymore. And that's one of the reasons why collaboration between the United States and others is falling apart. You mentioned health. It used to be pretty evident in the United States that vaccines for children was a good thing. It now is a debatable proposition. The way in which COVID vaccines has been politicized as an issue within the U.S. for the last 4 to 5 years. A president who I think rightly can take extraordinary pride at Operation Warp Speed that produced COVID vaccines at a record pace, has been walking away from that singular achievement and appointed people to his cabinet who are going against the received scientific and medical wisdom of the past 60 years. So I don't see that as a basis for collaboration. I think the answer, the larger answer to your question, is that because we are now in an era of strategic competition, of one form or another, in which the United States, by the way, is one of the great competitors because it is challenging received wisdom. Those who agree on both the nature of the threat and the steps that need to be taken need to coalesce. And that is going to be less than global, almost by definition, in almost every instance, including that of climate, where I think every country in the world, except for the United States, now accepts the science of climate. But the U.S. no longer does. Well, what does that mean? It means that the other countries will have to, on that issue, collaborate in a way that advances the challenge of a changing climate and the causes thereof, and deal with them. And so I think what you're going to see, from a UK perspective, should be encouraged, is coalitions that are the largest possible to deal with the challenges that they face. And I think when it comes to the issue of global order writ large, I would suggest that the UK is well off and better off to form coalitions with like-minded countries across the globe to address these things. Mr. Dworkin rightly mentions the importance of the G7 in the last few years, but we don't have a G7 anymore. We have a G6+1, and we saw that in Canada. There were 6 countries that were there and 1 that left, and hardly participated. And indeed, the finance minister did not participate, and the foreign minister did not participate in some of the ministerial meetings beforehand. But the 6 were doing fine, and I would argue the 6 can be enlarged with countries like Australia and others to be part of it. India on certain issues as well. And so I think the order we're moving into is one of overlapping groupings, some of which the U.S. will be part of, some of which will be led by China, as indeed is true in the BRICS. And some of which are going to have neither of them. And, this idea, for example, that Ursula von der Leyen has put on the table of a new trading order that combines Canada, the UK, the EU, and CPTPP, not as a treaty per se, but as a rule-setting order that would neither have China nor the United States as part of it, I think is the kind of way in which the order needs to evolve, and provides huge opportunity for a country like the UK to actually put a stamp on global order in a way that may not have been as much the case when the United States was the undisputed leader of the free world.
Lord Daalder. Thank you. Ambassador, I share your existential sort of dismay or despair at the destruction of the last 6 months of the international rules-based order and the damage done to international institutions. most of which, as you say, were created by American statesmen 80-odd years ago. You said something, though, earlier that you thought there was no going back to the way things were because of the loss of trust in America. And I get that point. But I would say that over in Europe, when the Biden administration succeeded Trump 1, it did feel almost overnight like a lot of things had gone back to the way they were. And on the what turned out to be wrong prediction that Trump was a kind of one-term phenomenon, there was quite a lot of complacency built up that the world had been restored to what it was. All of which now shattered by Trump 2 and by the much later, much greater degrees of destruction achieved in the first 6 months than during the whole of his first term. But just suppose that you get a new American leadership in 28, which does want to restore multilateralism as the key mechanism of solving international challenges and crises. And just suppose Europe gives you a pass, and yes, there's a bit of loss of trust, but there's so much enthusiasm for getting back to how things were. I mean, is there the support, do you think, in American politics, amongst the American public, in the media, any kind of return to the status quo pre-Trump, or do you think that is now gone forever? And if I may ask just a second part of the question, you've mentioned G7 already, or G6+1, but if you look at what's left with international institutions lying in wreckage around us, you've got the G7, you've got the G20, NATO perhaps, your specialist subject, a bit restored because of European countries stepping up to the plate and promising much greater expenditure. So that NATO summit was a lot better, the one a couple of weeks ago, than some of the ones during Trump's first term. You've still got the World Bank and the IMF working and respected and reasonably functioning. There's still the potential for coalitions of the willing. And if you look back to the 80s, some of the most important international deals done in the 80s were, of course, bilateral between the US and Russia and the Soviet Union on arms control issues. And you can imagine an era in which there are big bilateral deals done between US and China, which actually make the world a better and safer place. So are you entirely pessimistic about the future, or do you think we can build something out of that kind of structure if there is no going back to the post-war rules-based order?
I mean, I think those are all excellent questions, and I should say that I've learned more about Donald Trump from our conversations in the past than from many others. So it's great to see you again in this new role. I think I would answer it in two ways. Number one, I do think that we have created, not just over the past 6 months, but really over the past 5 years, a fundamental different political culture in the United States. I mean, Donald Trump won 77 million votes, the second largest number of votes in the history of the presidency. Only Joe Biden in 2020 had more. And although, like all elections, a good number of those votes were not pro-Trump, but anti the other side, a good number of votes were pro-Trump. And his popularity within his own voting base remains very strong. The rest of the country, he has lost, but he frankly never had. And so I do think that there is now a media ecosystem, frankly, a Republican Party that has been so changed, so transformed by the fact that he has been the dominant political figure within the political structure now for almost 10 years, 10 years, I guess. That I find it hard to think that that we will find the same kind of Republican Party that we had under George H.W. Bush. It's just hard to see that happening. By the way, hard to see Democrats believing that be the case. So the divisions that we've seen today, I think, will persist. The second point, and I think you actually hinted at the answer, very different than the first term, when in fact I think most of the world looked at this as an anomaly, that hopefully a disease that would be cured, and indeed was. by the biggest electoral margin and victory in a long time, the Joe Biden winning in 2020. It was not surprising, therefore, that America is back and greeted as such was understandable. Although, as President Biden said at the time, people do ask me for how long, and now we know. That's no longer the case. There is no one, as far as I can see, who is sitting here and saying the United States will be back in the same way that it was before. I was at the Munich Security Conference when J.D. Vance launched an extraordinary attack on the host government politics, and indeed on all European countries in terms of the enemy within being larger than Russia and China as a threat to the security of Europe. Then something fundamental has changed. And the reality of that means that countries are going to take steps that increase their independence and reduce their dependence on the United States. And to take the most obvious example, again, in my own field, Germany, by the end of the Trump term, Germany will be spending more on defense than it did during the Cold War. It will be the third largest military power in the world at 3.5% of German GDP. That's a serious amount of money. And that means that Germany is going to have a bigger stake within NATO, a bigger stake within, and a bigger say within Europe overall than it has had in any time since 1945. And that is transformative. I spend a lot of time with our Canadian friends up north here since I live in Chicago. They're not going back. It's done. I mean, Donald Trump has done something that no one ever thought possible. He created Canadian patriots. And it's extraordinary, but he did. And so countries are taking their measure and they will move on. Now, would they like to cooperate with the United States? Would they like to work with the U.S. that is committed to multilateralism? Of course, but will they defer to the U.S. in the same way they've done in the last 80 years? No, because the need will be less as a result. And so the fundamental flaw in Trump's foreign policy is the belief that others don't have agency. They do. They have choices. He likes to say, I run a big department store and I set the price for when they come in. Well, they also have the choice not to shop in the United States. That's the weakness of his approach. It's why the U.S. will be weaker as a result of what has happened already to date. And therefore, it will be different in 2029, assuming even we get to 2029 with a new president and a return to a more multilateral perspective. So that's why I think something good may come out of it, but it would be very different. And again, places more responsibility on countries like the UK to take on a bigger role in collaboration with others.
Dworkin, do you want to add?
Yes, very much in agreement. I mean, I think, as I said before, I think some of these changes were inevitable. They were happening anyway. And I think what Trump has done has turbocharged the kind of disruption of the international order. There was already, I think, some question about whether the U.S. would continue to play that leadership role, was it appropriate for the U.S. to do it? And he's really made that into a kind of urgent and existential question for others now. I think there was a excessive degree of complacency after Biden won the presidency among some of the United States allies. I think to some degree, Biden himself was although he was the right president for mobilizing a coalition to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think in some respects, his vision of the international order was somewhat backward-looking, and perhaps he wasn't the right president for thinking about how to reform the system. He came in with a really kind of deep belief in the U.S. continued role as leadership, leader of the free world. But I think we are, particularly now, heading into this multi-aligned world. an a la carte world, as our organization has called it. And I think, very much as the ambassador said, I think we will see a sort of patchwork of overlapping organizations, the ones that you mentioned and others. The G7 is turning into the G6+1, but it was, Canada also invited South Africa, India, Brazil, Mexico, Ukraine, South Korea, Australia to attend the meeting. So you see there the sort of potential dynamics. And I think we will see in different areas and in different kinds of subjects attempts to form new coalitions. I think, forms of order will emerge, but it'll be more fragmented. I think it'll be more unstable. I think there's a real danger, if you look at some of the kind of challenges that are coming up with, particularly in the technology field, a real danger of instability, of competition, potentially leading to conflict. And, I think the urgent question is how to find coalitions that can both preserve the kind of shared interests that I think we in the West and these other countries I mentioned have, but at the same time not accelerate a sort of potential fragmentation between, a kind of a bloc that the West is involved, in, and the kind of Chinese technological bloc. I think many countries around the world want to avoid that kind of outcome, but clearly the risk is there. So that, I think, is the urgent question, and the US should have a central role in kind of dealing with this big transition that we have coming up. But Trump is not contributing constructively as of now to these challenges. He's focused on very different issues.
Thank you. Baroness Morris.
Well, it's inevitable that when you get to the end of such an interesting evidence session that you've almost, in the last question, answered my question, but I'll put it anyway in case there's anything else that you would like to add, because it's looking at it a slightly different way, which is to what extent can effective global government exist without American leadership? And if the US does retreat, which it clearly is, which states or coalitions might be the ones that step forward? I mean, you've already mentioned Germany and everything. Mr. Dworkin, would you like to start off, and then I'll go to Ambassador Daalder?
Yes, I mean, I did to some degree address this in my last answer, so I can try and be brief. I mean, I think it's, there will be different forms of grouping, I think, for different issues. We're not going to see a cohesive order. We're going to see more of a fragmented order. But I think there still are a lot of countries out there that share a belief that operating through rules does serve the common interest, does serve their collective interest. We've seen a real increase in trade agreements being constructed kind of around the United States. We've seen a lot of discussions of the sort that took place at the G7 with different partners, thinking how they can address challenges like global imbalances, development questions. We've seen sort of developments in the security field, regional countries trying to come together. We've seen a little bit in the Middle East, obviously very destabilized at the moment, but we've seen sort of potential new kind of coalitions emerging there to try and manage the situation more locally. And I think this is really what's going to continue. I think there will be forms of global governance, but it's a transitional period, and I think there are risks of instability, risks of conflict, and I think really it's essential that we get the balance right between trying to work out how we can promote our own sort of vision and values of international cooperation, but do it in a way that accommodates and lives with other values, so that or other worldviews which are out there now, in a way that we can coexist peacefully without kind of giving up on our aspirations and our vision of what truly is the best foundation for order.
Thank you. Ambassador Daalder, have you got anything else to add?
Yeah, perhaps let me sum it up in this way, because I think your question had got to the core of it. It's true that global governance over the last 80 years is uniquely driven by the leadership of one country, and that U.S. leadership, leader of the free world, whatever you want to call it, was the core ingredient that both created the order as it was and maintained it over time. And I think we now live in a world in which this is no longer the case. And I don't think it ever will be the case again. Ever is a long time, but not anytime soon, including not any time after the Trump administration were to disappear from the political scene. And therefore, the challenge is for those who still believe in a rules-based form of global governance to figure out a way to lead it without the United States. If the U.S. wants to participate, great, as a variety of members and Mr. Dworkin said, that when it comes to the World Bank and the IMF, but in the World Bank too, if the conclusion is of states that it needs to be part of an effort that deals with climate change, it should do so. And so the challenge now is to find what is the alternative to American leadership. And part of it is going to lie in fragmentation, which is to say various countries are going to collaborate on various different issues that we have both talked about. But I would argue that there are a number of countries that have an outsized responsibility to take over American leadership. And those happen to be the countries that have been closest in helping the United States drive this global governance system over the past 80 years. Our friends and allies, the UK, the countries of the European Union, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, at times Mexico, perhaps Brazil, India, and others, and to find ways of organizing groupings that make explicit the need to uphold a rules-based order that is being challenged today, not just by Russia, not just by China, but by the United States. And a degree of confidence in the ability of this grouping to actually take on those who would behave in ways that are contrary to the rules and not accept it. We will see what happens with the trade deadline on August 1st, but I would encourage the European Union to hold fast. It's important. And to find other ways to work together. I believe the Canadians will. I actually believe the EU will well. And as a result, I think there is a way in which leadership can be exerted now by different countries. And to conclude, that's the opportunity. It's a huge opportunity. It's a huge responsibility, but it's also a huge opportunity. As the former mayor of Chicago and Rahm Emanuel used to say, never let a crisis go to waste. I believe Prime Minister Churchill might have said that as well. But there is a crisis here, and there's an opportunity that needs to be grabbed. And in some ways, this is it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Having listened to our witnesses this afternoon, I know we can't go forward simply by saying, all Western allies should hold their collective rules-based noses until the next US election. But when we talk about reform of the institutions, is it realistically an opportunity for the UK and the US to work together, or would it make any difference if we set out an agenda for reform for the multilateral organizations, the UN, the WTO, the World Health Organization? If we set out or began to work on a reform program, and as long as I've been in politics, there have been calls for reforming the UN, Would that mean anything to this current US administration? Are they really interested in reform of the institutions, or has that boat sailed? If I can ask Mr. Dworkin first.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good question. I think, in principle, if we look at what the administration has said, I think there should be some scope for cooperation if we take it in good faith that there's a real interest in reforming the functioning of the UN. That's an interest that we in the UK share, and I've heard from people in the FCDO that this is one of our priorities. I mean, change is coming to the United Nations because simply by dint of the funding question, the cuts in funding mean that either it does the same range of things even less effectively because of the significant cuts in funding, or it seizes the opportunity to streamline. We've seen quite a lot of suggestions coming out of the UN Secretariat with the UN80 process. Clearly there is a lot of overlap. The UK has a tradition, it has a kind of track history of assessing critically the functioning of the multilateral system. And I think there could be some scope, but that does depend on the US approaching it in good faith. And I think, it's probably worth distinguishing between the areas where there might be perhaps some cooperation and others where it might be more difficult. So I think in terms of efficiency, in terms of reducing bureaucracy, reducing overlaps, streamlining, all of that, one could see a shared agenda. One of the other questions that's very live, I think, now in the around the UN is the question of voice and inclusion and representation from the countries in the global south. And there, I think, we're likely to meet quite a lot more resistance from the United States, because I think its vision of making these institutions serve US interests more directly is not going to be one that conduces to giving other countries greater power. And for that reason and others, I would be a bit skeptical about looking at the kind of membership of the Security Council and others. But I think the functioning of the bodies is worth pursuing and testing the faith of the administration. Beyond that, the other institutions you mentioned, well, the US, I think, is more or less checked out of these institutions. Obviously, they're out of the WHO and the World Trade Organization. They're kind of clearly pretty hostile too. What Trump is doing could hardly be more inimical to the kind of underlying rules of the WTO in terms of his use of tariffs. So I think that's a discussion that will have to continue, perhaps with more like-minded partners. I think these institutions will be, difficult to reform. It's worth making the effort, but alongside that, I think also worth pursuing some of the other kind of parallel processes that we've talked about a bit in health, in trade, kind of plurilateral trading agreements and so on.
Thank you. Ambassador Daalder.
I would just, I think, add that the problem of reforming these institutions is so large that thinking you can have the United States as a partner in that effort will make it even larger and more difficult. So I think you're much better off in many ways to try to figure out what the reform agenda should be without the United States, because they're not likely to be particularly useful players, even, I would argue, in the UN. Where the guiding philosophy of the United States is not to be constrained. And the guiding philosophy of reform should be to have rules that work well, but apply equally to all. And if it doesn't, you don't have rules, you have exceptions. And so I do think there is scope for reform. I think there's huge scope for reform in the WTO or in the world trading system, let's put it that way. I just don't think the United States, or frankly China, should be part of that discussion. But a country, the EU, the UK, the CPTPP countries, which by the way includes Canada and Mexico, should have a fundamental role to play in that. As for the global institutions which have equal membership for all, I think the focus in the UN should be on agencies as opposed to the institutions in New York and Geneva per se, because that's where there is more scope for actually doing good, and the systems work in a different way. I would also warn about the retreat of the United States from these institutions is leading China to double down in trying to control them. And you are seeing that in the UN in terms of its financial and other commitment in New York, where already the UN, the Chinese delegate presence in the UN is larger than that of any other country. That's only going to increase. And to the extent that China's view of these institutions is perhaps not the same as the UK's, there is a limit to how one might want to think about reforming these institutions in collaboration with the Chinese.
Lord Bruce.
Thank you. Thank both of you. Absolutely fascinating insights. And I think, well, 25 years ago, I was at a party in New York to celebrate Hillary Clinton's election to the Senate. And strewn around the hotel were a lot of campaign leaflets from Democratic candidates saying things like, to their voters, I don't have a passport, and I promise if elected I will not apply for one. I will not support America to any international institutions. These were Democrat candidates 25 years ago. So isn't the reality the history of America, right from its very foundation through the War of Independence, has been detachment rather than engagement? It's only actually the post-war factor which was actually an aberration, but you both said we're heading in that direction. What I want to ask, therefore, is what should the UK's priority be? Should it be trying to rebuild the world without the United States, whilst recognising, obviously, we have to keep all our communications open, and we want to keep those communications open? Yes, the UK government can presumably walk and chew gum, so it's not a question of you've got to do one or the other. But it's a bit, as Baroness Crawley's point, that we need to demonstrate to the United States that the world is capable of putting things together, with or without them, and that in the process of doing that, they might be persuaded that it's not in their interest to be on the outside of such institutions, especially if they see, for example, accommodations with China, because that's the practicality. So I suppose to both of you is how should we prioritise that? And I suppose I'd put a footnote. We shouldn't be too priggish about isolationism. This country has voted to leave the European Union. And has done it on the back of we can be another great country again on our own. And we've followed the same argument, and our government has cut aid, underfunded our soft power, all of those things. So we're not actually totally guiltless of following that agenda. But so does that undermine our leadership? Because we have. Ambassador.
So I think you put it. You answered your own question in my view, which is to say I fully agree that the UK should prioritize the reform and strengthening of a rules-based system on the issues that matter most to the UK, which is many of the issues you mentioned, trade, development, other issues, to do it together with like-minded countries that are actually committed to it, but do it in a way that leaves the door open to the United States if and when it comes to its census to come back and be a participant in that process. But in doing so, to actually create leadership structures and ways to move forward that are not dependent on the United States. The difference between 16, the first term was in many ways that countries refused to take the steps that were necessary to deal without the United States. That's no longer the case. And so I think it is about an open door policy, to coin a phrase, that as you move to strengthen the cooperative elements among the like-minded countries, what people in the international relations literature now call the middle powers, not Russia, not China, not the United States, but everyone else. Those middle powers collectively have more power than anyone else. And so to be able to figure out how to encourage the cooperation among those countries, and to do so in a way that says to any country, not just China and whomever, if you want to cooperate within our rules, you're welcome. But there are rules, and we're not changing them. Or at least we only change them together. We don't change them because you don't like them. That's the policy, and that's the priority. So the priority should be to create the cooperative structures with other countries that are still committed to the very norms, the very rules, the very structures, the very idea of global governance that the UK is. Footnote, and your footnote accepted. Would have been easier as a member of the EU. I'm no doubt about it. But we are where we are. And as a result, I think that is the approach to not do it as a way to counter the United States, but as a way to foster the kind of global cooperation that is necessary to deal with the problems that exist today and that the UK on its own can't deal with.
Very much agree. I mean, I think as I guess I've tried to sketch out a bit, I think there are sort of urgent challenges facing the UK, facing the international system, facing particularly our partners and like-minded countries. And it's really important to try and get on with tackling them. And that has to be done through cooperation and through collaboration, because these are issues where we need to work with other countries and really beyond the G7 countries, I think, which is why it's important to be talking to and working with countries like Brazil, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Turkey, the others I mentioned. And I think that we can't wait for the United States. We can't allow ourselves to be distracted by what they're doing. We have to get on without them, and I think to some degree that's happening. And you know, there are different forms, new forms of cooperation that are emerging around Europe, even outside the EU. And I think these should all be encouraged. I think, as you know, as the ambassador and I think you both said, I think the door should be open. This space for the US to come back should be there. But we have to get on with working together. And I think I think there is going to be a kind of particular complication in doing this for the UK, because the UK has always had this sort of historically very close relationship with the US. And to some degree that still offers some opportunities. And I mentioned in my first answer, I think, the trade agreement. You know, it offers some tangible benefits to the UK, and yet it also is potentially problematic. And you know, I know we don't know all the details, but is it compatible with the WTO, the rules of the WTO, and the rules-based trading system? It's not 100% clear. You know, I think it's good that the UK has now signed up to the arbitration panel, the MIPA. You know, I think that's a sign of the way to go. It'll be a kind of, you know, to some degree, a complicated balancing act for the UK. But I think really it's very important in this country's interest to play its role in cooperating, in looking for solutions, in working with these kinds of like-minded countries, in not giving up on the attempt to find cooperative solutions to global challenges. So I hope that the UK will really, you know, commit to that agenda in quite an active way.
This has been a really important and helpful session. I'd hoped to finish by 5 o'clock. I've got 2 more questions, which I hope could be quick. Are you able to accommodate us? Thank you very much, Lord Horton.
Yeah, and perhaps, Ambassador, by all means, if you've got one, it's a bit of a defence spotters question. In the policy context of accommodating China, could America just walk away from the AUKUS treaty because it's a bit of a minor irritant in the challenges? Certainly gives us challenges to our defence budget and to our industrial capacity. Might the President just walk away from it and dismiss it, or is it of a higher standing? Because we've got a sort of a joint political, everybody's bought into AUKUS as if it's absolutely fundamental to our nation's future. Do you have a view? Firstly, on the Ambassador, and maybe Mrs. Doctor as well.
Could the United States walk away from AUKUS? Yes, without much regret or issues. If the judgment is that it is America's interest to stay within AUKUS, it will. If the judgment is that it, in the short term in particular, is a net negative, it won't. And indeed, the entire review is driven in the Pentagon by a view that that the short-term consequences of AUKUS are negative. In particular, that the United States needs to retain some of its nuclear submarines rather than provide them to Australia, given the threat that exists in the Pacific. Now, that may change because the United States may decide that there is no longer a threat in the Pacific, that a trade deal or some deal with China is sufficient to eliminate that threat, which is equally possible, in which case AUKUS becomes a more interesting trade relationship in which the United States can make some money, which is how this administration tends to look at these kinds of things. That's the problem you have with this administration, which is it can change its mind. And it is very hard to know on what basis it will do so other than some short-term transactional arrangement. And even one that I think we all agree that AUKUS has many positive elements, particularly the other pillars of AUKUS. But that does not deter this administration from making short-term decisions, which is how it's driven in every instance to make its decisions.
I won't say anything on the security aspect, but I'll just make two quick points. The first is, given the extraordinary importance of the US-China relationship in today's international system, it is quite striking, looking from the UK, that we still don't have a clearer idea of where this administration stands and what it's trying to achieve in terms of its relations with China. And I think that, as the ambassador said, I think very much, probably comes down to Donald Trump himself. But, we're still waiting, is my sense, to see exactly how that's going to play out. And the second thing is, in terms of China's place in the emerging sort of framework of global governance that we've been discussing. I think we've put a lot of emphasis, rightly, on working with like-minded countries whose values we share, whose vision of international organization and cooperation we share, and that China is, to some degree, a kind of antagonist or a rival, a competitor in that respect with a different vision. But I think we, at the same time, China, its size and its importance and its wealth means that we have to find a way of coexisting with it. And I think there is another aspect to global governance that that should be looking at ways that, to the degree that we need to work together, whether it's on simply avoiding conflict or managing the kind of evolution of new technology, or on questions like international debt or climate. That there is a residual element of global governance that has to involve a mutual kind of modus vivendi with China.
Lord Grocott. Yes, very quickly. I mean, there is a real tendency in these kind of discussions, it seems to me, to develop a notion that there was somehow a sort of a golden age when the international rules-based international order was functioning wonderfully and the powerful were helping the weak, and the United States was acting against its own self-interests if it was for the greater good. I think it would be quite difficult to think of specific examples of that, though I'm sure Ambassador Daalder could. But even wherever you decide to start this discussion, I mean, prior to the Second World War, American isolationism, obviously in the First World War and the League of Nations and all the preliminaries to the Second World War, was a very, very strong isolationist. But even if you're looking at the last 80 years, which is what most of the references to world rules-based international order focuses, I mean, where was the rules-based international order during the Vietnam War, for example? Where was it during the Iraq War? Where is it, or could it be in relation to Israel-Palestine? It seems to me that a very, very powerful nation like the United States, the most powerful nation, does understandably act in its own interests, and not a lot of evidence of self-flagellation in respect of helping the weaker, and that therefore there are big elements in the Trump approach, which, by the way, I don't like, but leave that aside, which are very much in keeping with
large swathes of US history. I mean, is that too pessimistic a view of the world, and was there a golden age?
I mean, a golden age is not the word that I would use, but I think there was a recognition sometime in early 1942 that America's security, America's prosperity, and ultimately America's freedom required that others would be secure, prosperous, and free as well. And that indeed, the United States now had the responsibility as the greatest power on earth to help foster a system that could bring that about. At no time did FDR or Harry Truman, or indeed any other American leader, believe that this was that this system that was created out of the ruins and ashes of World War II, a goodwill gesture to others. It was fundamentally in America's interest, and it's self-interest, and I think that is the core misunderstanding on the part of the current administration. Ronald Reagan didn't believe in NATO because it was somehow nice to do to others. It believed in NATO because the absence of war in Europe was fundamental to America's security. It's that simple. Ronald Reagan didn't believe in fair and free trade rules because he wanted to be nice to other countries. He believed it was fundamental to America's prosperity. And that is true for Reagan. It was true for Nixon. It was true for Kennedy. It was true for Carter. It was true for Obama, and to some extent Biden, although I agree that the way he looked at the system was looking backwards rather than forward. That is the fundamental difference. Now, did the U.S. Abide by all the rules that we were hoping others would be? No, of course not, because we were too powerful. And we made tremendous errors, tremendous mistakes. But the unique realization that a system that benefits others would also benefit us was important. The Marshall Plan was not some largesse. It was fundamentally the belief that the rebuilding of Europe was necessary as part of a fight against Soviet communism and its expansionism, and that a strong and capable and wealthy Europe would be stronger and more capable to withstand the threat. What was then the true threat from within? Communism and subversion, as well as the threat from without, the Soviet Union. So I am, and I think most American leaders believe that this is something, that this system served America well, not because it was helpful to other people, although that was nice, but fundamentally because it served America's interest. And it is the abandonment of that view at a time when America's power is not as strong as it was 80 years ago, that I think is short-sighted and wrong. But it is, I think, no less an abandonment of that view.
Absolutely. I think I completely agree that the right way to think about this is how is the United States defining its interests, rather than is the United States acting out of altruism. And what we see now is a definition of U.S. interests coming from the White House that is extremely striking and transactional, and that one might even say occasionally seems to kind of overlap with the personal interests of the president. I think, was there a golden age? I think there wasn't a golden age, and I think it's also important to recognize that when we talk about the rules-based order, it wasn't as if there was one order that was put in place in 1945 and that existed until the kind of 2016 or 2024. There was a kind of an attempt at the end of the Second World War to build institutions precisely that would avoid what had happened in the aftermath of the First World War, which had led so quickly again to war in Europe, and that became a global war. There was an attempt to learn those lessons by creating international security and economic structures that would prevent that. That was succeeded very quickly by a Cold War order, and we saw the kind of security institutions like NATO and so on growing up, and they did a very good job of keeping the peace. in Europe and defending Europe. Then after 89, we've seen a kind of attempt to evolve this order. I would say probably an incomplete effort with some different views, probably different views in Europe and the United States about exactly how this order should evolve. But questions about how and far and in what way Russia or China could be integrated into a single order. And to some degree, I think those projects, for various reasons, didn't lead to the results that their creators had hoped for. And I think that, to some degree, is the cause of some of the kind of wider uncertainties that I think we face now, even beyond the personal predilections of the current US president. But I think I very strongly believe that in answering these challenges, that cooperation and rules-based cooperation remains absolutely in the interests of the UK, of the United States, of our allies, and more widely. And I think that has to be our guiding principle as we look forward.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Daalder, Mr. Dworkin, very much indeed. That's a very helpful contribution to our inquiry. Thank you very much indeed.